Hello everyone. This is now the second video in our series on the history of Jehovah's Witnesses. Again, James Penton will be with us using his vast knowledge of JW history to expound on the history of the movement under Rutherford. And it is remarkable how witnesses are constantly counseled not to pursue higher education, and even to the point where an elder will be removed if he puts his children through university. And this happens often. And we can see now why in the example of James. Because here is a man who has studied and has been exposed to a great wealth of knowledge, and because of that can see the failings of the organization. To control people, one wonderful technique, and I use wonderful in its negative sense, is to deny them information, to control the flow of information, to get them believe that only you are the source of information. But once they are exposed to information outside of that control element, everything changes. Anyways, you're going to learn some very interesting things about the witness movement under its second president, actually its third, to be accurate, J.F. Rutherford. And so without further ado, here is James Penton.
Hello, friends. This is the second discussion that I want to have with you about the history of Jehovah's Witnesses, or the Watchtower Society. Actually, before 1931, this organization was called that of the Bible Students, or International Bible Students. But the name was changed in 1931 by the president of the Watchtower Society, Judge Rutherford. Now, I want to talk to you today about what happened when Judge Rutherford became the second president of the Watchtower Society. Leading up to that, of course, was the death of Charles Taze Russell, the first president of the Watchtower Society, who died on October the 31st, 1916, which was a real blow to many of the Bible students at that time. 1914 had occurred as the year of the outbreak of the First World War, and Russell believed that before the war ended, the system of things would end. First, Christendom would collapse, and then the nations would collapse, and what would happen would be the Battle of Armageddon, and the Bible students would be taken off into the air to be with Christ, and the rest of mankind that were still living would pass on into the millennium. Russell did not think of the Battle of Armageddon as the destruction of all society. He believed that it would be a battle between capitalism and labor, and he had hope for many passing through the Battle of Armageddon into the millennium. And he believed that the Jews would be the governing force in the millennium, and then people would be brought back from the dead, and there would be a government of all of the people living under the millennium who would be under Christ. And Russell did not believe in the text in the book of Revelation, which says the rest of the dead lived not until the 1,000 years were ended. He thought that was a spurious text, even though most scholars believe that it was proper in the book of Revelation. And it is pretty evident today that Russell was wrong about that, but he had a much more kindly review or view, I should say, of what was going to happen than what his successor, Judge Rutherford, Joseph Rutherford, was to have as time went by. But I want to talk about the change that took place after Russell died. Now, Rutherford had been the lawyer for the Watchtower Society, but he was having bad times and his wife was quite ill. So he believed that he should move out to California where she would be better off. And he hoped that he could practice law out in California. So Charles Russell loaned him $1,000 to set up his business in California. But curiously, at the time that Russell died, Rutherford was in Ohio, and he received a strange message notifying him of Russell's death. Now, why do I say a strange message? Well, it was from a man who had been placed over the governance of the Watchtower Society for a period of time until Russell returned from his trip to California. He had gone out to California and was coming back on the train when he died. And this gentleman called for Rutherford to be notified, and Rutherford immediately came to New York, where the headquarters of the Watchtower Society had been since 1909. Now, this man was anxious to have Rutherford come and be a party to the governance of the Bible students. Instead of the vice president taking over from Russell after he died, the board decided that they should set up a triumvirate to rule the society. And they did just that. And Rutherford, who had been the society's lawyer and who was still a director of the organization, was one of the triumvirate. Now, a curious thing happened at the time of Russell's funeral, or shortly thereafter. Russell had died, and many had hoped that before he died, he would have produced a 7th volume to his system of 6 volumes called the Millennial Dawn books, or volumes, I should say. And he never got around to writing the 7th volume, which it was hoped would be about the book of Revelation. Now, as a matter of fact, Russell, who was growing old and not well, had made a specific statement to the effect that he wouldn't complete the set. Someone else could write the 7th volume. Well, what happened was that Rutherford, at that time, went to a friend and asked this friend if Russell was to have a successor. Now, Russell had accepted the title Faithful and Wise Servant. This man that Rutherford contacted was P.S.L. Johnson, a man who was of Jewish birth and raising, but who had converted to Lutheranism for a time, and then, after having been placed in contact with Russell and Russell's ideas, had converted to the Bible students. Pardon me. In the days prior to Russell's death, this man, P.S.L. Johnson, Paul Johnson, was regarded as one of the most brilliant lights in the Bible student community. After all, he was very well educated, had a religious education, had taught as a Lutheran minister, and knew the Hebrew background, and was regarded as one of the most intelligent members of the community. He was used as a spokesman for the Watchtower Society, although he was not at headquarters, but he came to the headquarters at Russell's funeral, and the result was that he and Rutherford got together. Now, they had been and were good friends. And Rutherford asked Johnson if Russell would have a successor, as I mentioned. Now, in that case, Johnson said, well, he wasn't certain and he'd have to think about it a little better. And a few days later, he came back to Rutherford and said, yes, he thought that there would be a successor to Rutherford, and this person would be the steward of the account in Matthew chapter 20, where he was the steward of a number of workers who were hired, and some came in early and some came in late, and then ultimately they were all given a denarius or a penny. In any case, it's pretty evident that from the very beginning, Johnson began to consider who that steward would be. Actually, in Matthew 20, the person is called a householder. And who would the householder or steward be? Who would give the penny to the workers? He was great on types and antitypes, and he thought that the parable of the householder or the steward applied to the Bible student community. And so he was wondering who would be the steward of the Bible student community after Russell's death. Well, the interesting thing is that not only did Johnson begin to think that he was the steward, but Rutherford too began to think that he was the steward of the penny. Now, what this meant was that Rutherford then, after his election in January of 1917, he decided to take on an extra activity without referring it to the board of the Watchtower Society. Now, it's quite evident that Russell had thought that when he died, the board as a whole would take over the management of the society, not one single person. But Rutherford, as soon as he became president, began acting in the same way that Russell had, as the dominant figure within the Bible student movement. At the time, there was a very influential woman, evidently a woman who was quite wealthy, who met with a couple of Bible students in Philadelphia and suggested to them that they set out on collecting works by Russell and producing a book which would be the 7th volume to the studies that Russell had completed. These people gathered together and decided on what they would do. And so they produced a book which they named the posthumous book written by Russell, even though it wasn't. They were really the authors of this book. One of them produced a portion of an interpretation on the book of Revelation. The other continued on and produced more material in the 7th volume. Now, this book was brought to Rutherford, and he decided that he would go ahead and have the book printed without any reference to the board of directors of the Watchtower Society. The result was that over the spring of 1917, Rutherford became more and more of a dictator of the society. And the Board of Governors decided that a number of bylaws which had been passed at the convention of the society in January 1917 should be repealed. The result was that Rutherford created a situation where he could get rid of these members of the board, 4 members of the board who were opposing him, a majority of the board in actual fact. Now, what he did was he called a meeting, and at that meeting, he displayed the new book, the 7th volume, The Finished Mystery. And this was regarded as the work of Russell, but it laid on the tables during the meeting, and Rutherford also announced something else, and that was the dismissal of the 4 members of the board of directors who had opposed him. How could he do this? Well, he looked at the charter of the Watchtower Society, and according to the Watchtower Society's charter, when members were appointed, they were to be appointed for life unless Russell removed them. And he had them give him statements that they would resign, and they signed this, and he held this, and he had the power to remove any of these people, but he never did. Now, Rutherford came forth with the idea that the directors had to be re-elected on a yearly basis. Otherwise, they were not legitimate. And he referred to Pennsylvania law where the society was chartered. Now, a good many people since that day, critics of Rutherford, have denied that this was true, that this was in the law. But in fact, Rutherford did have the law behind him. A very good friend of mine who is writing a book on the whole matter of the period where Russell took over the society, or Rutherford rather, took over the society, questioned this, and I questioned it further in reviewing his work, and my son began to look into Pennsylvania law, and it proved that what Rutherford said was absolutely right. The directors of the society had to be elected on a yearly basis, even though the charter said that they didn't have to be. Now, what about this? Well, Rutherford was right for the wrong reason. Notice that he said they had to be re-elected on a yearly basis, but he argued that when the convention was held, the yearly meeting was held in Pittsburgh to determine who the officers of the society would be. He said, well, the 3 officers were not dependent upon this bylaw, or this law rather, in Pennsylvania. So he argued that he, the vice president, and the secretary-treasurer could all continue in office, but the other four could not. However, the charter specifically said that in order to be elected president, secretary-treasurer, vice president, one had to be a director. So in effect, he was pulling a very nasty trick on members of the board of directors, and by dismissing 4 directors. Because if they weren't members of the society or directors of the society, then Rutherford wasn't either, because he had been appointed for life and had not been elected on a yearly basis. So while he was right about the law, he applied it falsely. Well, this brought about a terrible break in the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. In the meantime, something else had happened. Russell had been disturbed about what was going on with the Bible student community and offices in England. And he had suggested that Paul Johnson, P.S.L. Johnson, go to England and sort things out. So the triumvirate that had been in power in November and December in New York decided to agree to that, and they sent Johnson over to England. Now, Johnson did see that there was real disagreement in the leaders of the Bible student movement in London, and he decided to use his powers, which were very complete powers, to rectify matters. Unfortunately, he got to be a little dictator himself and turned practically everyone against him. Also, he was to take the position that he was the steward of Matthew chapter 20. And after a breakdown of his relations with the British Bible students, he was forced to return home. Actually, Rutherford called him home, and Rutherford had determined that he had gone mad, and it certainly seemed that he had. His actions were very foolish indeed, and he returned home. And during the period that he was home, from the early spring of 1917, Rutherford treated him very badly, and he, of course, went to the other directors, and the other directors wanted him to be given a hearing out of fairness for him, not because they agreed with what he had done or with his behavior. Now, he had announced himself as that steward or that householder. Well, this was to place him in a position of great authority. But by that time, Rutherford himself had decided that he was the steward, and the penny was going to be the 7th volume. I have copies of this from 1917, when the finished mystery was produced. Now, this was supposed to be the work of Russell, but it really wasn't. And in the front of it, you see a picture of a penny or a denarius that the workers were to be paid in the parable. Besides that, there is a reference here to Matthew 20, verse 9. And this indicates that Rutherford thought he was the steward who was going to give the penny to the workers in the form of the finished mystery. And when he fired the members of the board of directors, that book was laying on the table. Now, the Watchtower Society has claimed, number one, that the person who was responsible for the Great Break was P.S.L. Johnson, Paul Johnson. And the Watchtower Society has claimed that the bitter row that followed during this meeting, when two members of the board of directors stood up and denounced Rutherford, they have claimed that this was over the finished mystery. They have argued, the Watchtower Society has argued, that the storm that occurred on that day when the directors were dismissed was because Rutherford had quietly and without notifying them that he was having the finished mystery presented and left to those within the community of Bible students. Now, in point of fact, this was an outright lie, and it's one that has been perpetuated by the Watchtower Society to this very day. None of these people had had a chance to read or examine the seventh volume, The Finished Mystery. What they were angry about was his dismissal of them from the board of directors of the Watchtower Society. And of course, after this meeting, they were forced out of the headquarters of the Watchtower Society, then called Bethel, as it has been since. And this brought about a tremendous schism within the Bible student community. And back and forth went the printed statements on both sides. And actually, I should say, the third side, which the side that was presented by P.S.L. Johnson. Now, during the fall of 1917, the split became widened, and Rutherford wrote a pamphlet on harvest siftings, as Russell had done in the 1890s. And this was replied to by the directors and for a time by the vice president, who went along with the old board and then changed his mind and was very quiet and left them hanging and rattling. And also, a pamphlet was put out by P.S.L. Johnson. Now, the Watchtower was to hold its new year of election in 1918, and of course by that time Rutherford had taken control of the society. Most of the Bible students heard from him because he controlled the printing and publishing apparatus, and they could not contact Bible students in the way that he could. And so when 1918 and the meeting in Pittsburgh again occurred, the opposition, who were shut out and the meeting controlled completely, they decided to break with the Watchtower Society. And the result was that Rutherford was to take full control along with his supporters. Now, something else was happening, of course, at that time, and that was that in the spring of 1917, the United States had entered into the First World War. The Congress passed what was known as the Espionage Bill or law, and it was an act of Congress and signed by the president and became law. Now, this meant that anyone who took a stand against the government or opposed conscription was liable to be taken to court and, if convicted, sent to prison. And anyone who did that was subject to a possible prison sentence of 20 years. Now, this almost immediately got the Bible students in trouble. The Finished Mystery had some very strong anti-war statements in it. Some of them were quoted from other sources, including Russell, and they were quite outspoken in using these passages in the Finished Mystery and also in other publications. And the result was that during the fall of 1917, the Bible students were fed publications of anti-war activity. The result was that a good many young men who were subject to the military draft were imprisoned. Others were held in military camps and ordered to put on the uniforms of soldiers. And when they wouldn't, they were subjected to harsh treatment. Now, this went on through the fall of 1917 and on into 1918. By the spring of 1918, the authorities had summoned a jury and had the Watchtower Society's offices raided and certain documents taken from it. The result was that Rutherford and 7 of his fellows were indicted, and after a long court trial, which says a great deal, they were convicted and sent to Atlanta, Georgia, for 20 years. Now, the curious thing is that immediately prior to the actions of the American government, Rutherford began to backpedal. He ordered certain sections taken out of the Finished Mystery. And then when the government said that wasn't enough, he ordered the Bible students not to circulate the Finished Mystery. He also took a different stand on the whole question of obeying the authorities with regard to military service, saying that he had never been against military service per se. It was simply that Bible students were conscientious objectors. On top of this, when in the spring of the year, the United States held a day of prayer for victory over the Central European powers, the Axis, he joined with the clergy of the United States in supporting that day of prayer and in praying, in effect, for an Allied victory over Germany. The man was an absolute hypocrite of the worst sort. But One of the things that he had done to protect himself was to accuse those who had broken with the society with supporting the American officials in having them sent to Atlanta, Georgia. In point of fact, this was not the case at all. None of the ones who had broken with the society were in sympathy with the government at all. They simply washed their hands of the whole matter, and they did not do anything to harm the Watchtower officials. This is a matter of clear proof from the documents that occurred at the time. And what it shows is that the Watchtower has produced a fake history of their own behavior. I should mention, too, that one of the things that Rutherford did while he was talking about not opposing what the American government had done, he called on his fellow Bible students to buy Liberty bonds or war bonds at the time. Now, this was shocking in the extreme, but most of the Bible students were so preoccupied with the fact that they were being persecuted in the United States. Many of them were mobbed, and in Canada, the authorities had earlier outlawed the Watchtower and the Finished Mystery, so that one could be sent to prison for a long time, 20 years again, and could be forced to pay a fine of $5,000, which was a tremendous amount at the time. Now, this shows how ridiculous Rutherford's change of coats was. But he had blamed the opposition, the Bible student opposition to him. And so when he was in Atlanta with his fellows, the Bible students got to see him and the others as martyrs to the cause. And so when in 1919, on appeal, the officers of the society were freed from Atlanta and they went back, Rutherford was clearly in control. And he used his martyrdom, even though he was no martyr really, as a means of staying in power. Now, what followed was a program which was very, very curious. What was that? That was his program of suggesting that millions now living would never die. And he argued that, and also he and his fellows set the year 1925 when the world would see a change, Christ would come, the millennium would begin, boys and girls would be able to live in a new world of righteousness and frolic about with the lambs and the lions. And of course, this brought many people into the organization. How so? Well, a great many men coming home from the battlefields of Europe heard the message of the Watchtower Society, and the Watchtower Society grew greatly. By the end of World War I, there were about 17,000 associated with the Bible students. Many had fallen away, some had come in. By 1925, which was used as the year when the world was to end and the millennium was to begin, there were about 100,000 associated on the basis of memorial statistics. By 1928, there were only about 17,000 partakers. In other words, there was a tremendous loss of members within the Bible student community. And Rutherford had to spend the rest of his presidency building up to the organization to what it was in 1925. And in actual fact, when he died in January of 1942, the fact is that the organization was only as large as it was in 1925. Rutherford was responsible for other things, however, and in changing the very nature of the Bible student community. In the first place, he wanted to take over the whole organization. Now, it should be remarked that Russell controlled the Watchtower Society because he was the president and he was the major contributor financially to its existence. But he believed in allowing the various ecclesias or congregations to be independent and to elect their own elders. Consequently, they could agree or disagree, and while most of them agreed with him almost slavishly, they were quite independent. And he never attempted to use a big stick on the congregations. His presentation was more suasive than coercive. That was not the case with Rutherford. Rutherford took over the control of the society and used that as a vehicle for taking over the entire Bible student community. He did this by beginning a program wherein he argued that all Bible students must become proselytizers by going from door to door. And this is an aspect that is stuck with Jehovah's Witnesses to this very day. Now, the fact was that many of the local elders in the very local congregations opposed this and wouldn't go along with this. And what happened was that in the late 1920s, Rutherford entered into a war, so to speak, with the elders of the various local congregations. And eventually he was able to create a situation where the congregations yielded in the main to his wishes and became organizations that were completely subservient to the Watchtower Society and to the Watchtower president. The fact was also that a great many people split from the organization at that day and went out. Some had gone out in 1925. Between 1925 and 1930, practically all of the old Bible students, with a very small margin being left to, or minority, I should say, left from the past, remained with the Watchtower Society. Most of the old Bible students who had been Russell's followers or supporters were gone by 1930. And a new group had come in. And this new group was entirely different in nature than the older group that had been part of the Watchtower Society and the Bible student community before. The earlier Bible students had been often middle class. usually of Anglo-Saxon background, but not entirely. Some Germans and some other Europeans, but largely of middle-class Anglo-Saxons and Northern Europeans. In the period when Rutherford took over, great numbers of people from other societies came in. There were large numbers of Italians, large numbers of Poles, large numbers of Greeks, and on and on. And many of these people, new immigrants, were workers, and they worked in the factories and other activities that new immigrants could find. So they were not a terribly well-educated group in comparison to the older group that had been a part of the Bible student community. Now, this was an important factor because they could be molded, but not all of them could. For instance, large numbers of the Polish community in Chicago broke away. Large numbers of the Italian community in Buffalo, New York, broke away. And large numbers of those who were in New England were Greek, and they broke away. So it wasn't just the old members who broke away. It was also many of the new immigrants who did this, and they became a sound background for Bible student movements that were apart from the Watchtower Society. It should be mentioned that there were by this time quite a number of ex-Bible student movements that disagreed with Rutherford. One of the groups was called the PBI, Pastoral Bible Institute. They were perhaps the most liberal of the groups. Then there was the layman group, which was P.S.L. Johnson's group, and it was far from liberal. P.S.L. Johnson took over that group, and he was every bit as much a dictator, if not more, than Rutherford was. Then there was the Dawn Bible Students, which developed in the early 1930s. And there were remnants of the old New Covenant movement that had revolted against Russell back in 1909. All of these were out there. So there were a variety of places that these people could go. And gradually, as time moved on, there was another group that developed, which took in many of the ethnic groups, called the Free Bible Students, who are still very active and are perhaps the most open and biblically oriented of the Bible student groups. But while this was happening, and there were breakaways, the fact is that Rutherford was becoming more and more doctrinaire and developed all sorts of curious ideas. In the first place, Christmas, which the old Bible students had celebrated, and other holidays, were abolished. You couldn't celebrate Christmas. You couldn't also celebrate birthdays. You weren't to tip a hat to ladies, as was customary in those days. This is the 1930s. One thing after another. And you were supposed to sacrifice everything, even responsibility to your parents, in order to go on the preaching work that Rutherford had established. Then he came up with the idea that there was to be an earthly class of Bible students, or by that time, Jehovah's Witnesses, because in 1931 he had come up with the name Jehovah's Witnesses. His ideology for suggesting this was a set of types, biblical types, which he imposed without any real argumentation. And that created rebellions among some of his close supporters. For instance, the branch manager of the Canadian arm of the Jehovah's Witnesses, a man by the name of Walter Salter, broke with Rutherford over his idea that there would be an earthly class of Christians who would remain here on the earth, and only 144,000 would go to heaven. He objected strongly to that, and for doing so, and because of claims of immorality and so forth that were made against him, he was dismissed. And then he published a statement attacking Rutherford, and quite rightly, he attacked Rutherford for the use of the extreme use of alcohol. Rutherford had produced a booklet attacking prohibition in the United States as of the devil, and he loved his booze. In fact, he was a drunkard. Rutherford was a drunkard, and this is clearly proven. When I was preparing my book, Apocalypse Delayed, I spent some time in California and went to the place in California, in San Diego, called the House of the Princes, Beth Sarim, and I was able to go through the place and see what it was like. I was able to find a lot about Rutherford in his trips from Brooklyn to Los Angeles and to San Diego. And I went to the drugstore where he had bought his liquor. And people at the drugstore, this was many years ago when I did this, people at the drugstore said that they had whole truckloads of alcohol, bottles of alcohol taken to Beth Sarim, his House of the Princes, in which he expected the ancient worthies from John, or from Abel to John the Baptist, would be resurrected and be able to live there. Well, it wouldn't have been big enough for them, but that didn't matter. It was big enough for Rutherford. He was a real drunkard, and one brother who had spent time at Watchtower headquarters came to a convention in Toronto, Canada in 1927, and this brother was with him, and he said, "We were worried. We didn't think that the judge would be able to give his public address. He was so inebriated that we didn't think he could do it. But we got him up to the podium, and talker that he was, it was just like turning on a machine, and he gave his address, even with a great deal of alcohol in him. For many, many years, he didn't see his poor wife in Los Angeles when he came out to California, and his wife and his son were alienated from him, and when he died, neither one of them appeared at his funeral or came down. So we can tell that the man was not looked upon even by his own wife and family. His wife remained a Bible student. His son didn't, even though his son had at one time been secretary to Charles Russell. So the man was a dictator and a falsifier of situations. He was also a man who could be very severe to anyone who opposed him within the organization. He not only mistreated Walter Salter very badly. But beyond and above that, he was guilty of treating the society's lawyer, Owen Moyle, in a very, very nasty way. Moyle had come to Brooklyn, where the Watchtower headquarters was, in order to defend Jehovah's Witnesses in their court cases over their right to go from door to door. Moyle became very dissatisfied with Rutherford. Rutherford's use of alcohol and the alcohol culture of the headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses upset him. He was a teetotaler, but he didn't censor anybody for taking a drink. He said that was none of his business. But he disliked the idea that everybody was expected to drink, and a lot of pressure was being brought on his son to drink and at Bethel. And on top of this, he was very upset by the way Rutherford acted in using rough language and in his favoritism. He pointed out that he had a rule saying that you had to marry someone who was also a fellow resident of Bethel, but he made exceptions for that. And it is clear that he had a woman who was supposedly his masseuse, who had deserted her husband and come to Bethel, and whom he took with him out to Beth Sarim. And while it can't be proven, but it seems reasonable to suppose that she was his mistress. He also agreed to allow his secretary to marry a man who was an important figure in the Coca-Cola company, but who had become a Bible student and also a director of the Watchtower Society, and they accompanied him to Beth Sarim every winter, where he had a 16-cylinder Cadillac car that had been given to him by a wealthy witness who regarded him as the greatest man on earth. All of these things show a charlatan here of the worst sort. And another thing that happened, and I have dealt with this in some detail in my book, Jehovah's Witnesses and the Third Reich, he at first attempted to ingratiate himself with the Nazis. And he produced a statement in a convention in June of 1933. He had written this, and it was translated into German after he left and went back to the United States, which attacked Great Britain and the United States, dissociated himself from the Jewish community, then undergoing terrible persecution. And only shortly before this, he had changed the society's teaching that the Jews were to go back to Palestine and to eventually rule over the people who came forth from the graves and had passed through Armageddon into the millennium. He simply broke with the Jews, and unlike Russell, who had been a real supporter of both the Jewish community and of Zionism, Rutherford changed the beliefs of the Watchtower Society to oppose Judaism and to oppose the Jewish community. And he was very, very severe. My father was present at a Bible student convention in the 1920s in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and he said about Rutherford, he said, I heard him say, and my father repeated this many times to me, he said he stood before the whole group of us, and he said, I'm talking about the Palestine Jew. I'm not talking about that stoop-shouldered, hook-nosed little fellow on the corner who tries to gyp you out of every nickel you've got. This was Rutherford. Crude, crude, crude. And so the Bible student community, which had been very warm towards the Jews, now suddenly became very critical of them. Some people who defend the witnesses in Germany say, well, the witnesses did very good things to some of the Jews in the concentration camps. This is true up to a point. The fact is that they tried to preach and convert the Jews, and if they did convert the Jews, then they were very warm and helpful to them. But if the Jews turned them down in their conversion efforts, they just left them go. And the Watchtower Society, after Rutherford's death, produced a book called Let God Be True. And in that book stated, 1946, that the Jews were responsible for what they had got. It showed the attitude that developed in the Bible student Jehovah's Witness community after Rutherford made this change. So Rutherford was far less than a good man. And it's interesting, too, that while events were going on in Germany, in the first place, he tried to cuddle up to the Nazis. And I don't apologize in any way in saying this. But after the Nazis showed that they wanted nothing to do with the Bible students as they were then, or Bibelforscher as they were called in Germany, rather than Jehovah's Zeugen, after the Nazis showed that they had nothing to do and would have nothing to do with Jehovah's Witnesses, then Rutherford, in effect, said, God is going to destroy you, Mr. Hitler, and we're going to take a strong stand against you, which was reasonable in one sense. They didn't have to support the Nazi regime at all, and they were about the only religion in Germany of any significance that did oppose the Nazis. That was reasonable, but what he did was he called on them to continue bringing Watchtower literature into the country, much of which was openly anti-Nazi, and going out at night and placing pamphlets and leaflets on the doorsteps of the German people. And of course, all the Nazis had to do was catch one or two persons, torture them so badly that they didn't know what they were doing, and they would tell of others who had been in this work of placing this literature. And of course, the whole lot of them would end up in concentration camps. And many did end up in concentration camps. Many were executed. And this has been studied carefully, although the statistics that were originally given by the Watchtower Society were overblown. Nonetheless, many of them did suffer terribly. And they deserve great credit for this. The ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany deserve great credit. But the fact that Rutherford drove them into this and encouraged them to do this was a terrible thing, because had they used more discretion, many of them would have lived that died. Curiously, two of the leaders of the Watchtower Society in Germany did distance themselves from the Watchtower Society in order to get out of prison and concentration camp. And at that point, Rutherford condemned them and said that he would do nothing, even if he could, to get them out of trouble. The man was an absolute hypocrite because these men did virtually the same thing that he had done in 1918. They were to be discredited. He wasn't to be discredited. He argued that God was with him. And his mistreatment of others, and I've mentioned the Moyle trial, which is very significant because Moyle was able to win in a suit against the Watchtower Society. By that time, Rutherford himself was dead, but he received $33,000 or thereabouts, plus court costs for being slandered in the pages of the Watchtower Society. So we can look at this period of the history of the Watchtower Society, the things that were done, the hypocrisy at the top, and that which led to unnecessary persecution by the secular states of the world. Virtually every country either limited the power of Jehovah's Witnesses and the Watchtower Society or outlawed it completely. I was a boy in Canada when on July the 4th, 1940, the Watchtower Society and Jehovah's Witnesses were banned completely at the behest of the Catholic Church in Canada, actually Cardinal Villeneuve, and it was outlawed until the fall of 1943, and Jehovah's Witnesses were held in work camps till quite a period after the Second World War, until John Diefenbaker, who later became a Prime Minister of Canada, stood up in Parliament and asked how many Jehovah's Witnesses were being kept in concentration camps. This was the legacy of one Joseph Franklin Rutherford. And if you want to read some of these things, I will refer you to a couple of books that I have written. Apocalypse Delayed is the name of one of them, and the other one is Jehovah's Witnesses and the Third Reich. And I have scrupulously established exactly what happened during this period. Thank you, and hope to see you later.